Hi, everyone. Bienvenue. Thank you for coming to the 69th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of Feminist and Social Justice Studies and the organizer of this series. Oh, and I meant to say at McGill University. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. I'm so excited to welcome you all. While this is our last event of the semester, we have a full winter lineup. Some of the speakers include Dr. Sava Sabeli Singh, Dr. Luke Stark, Beth Pickens, Indy Mitchell, Dr. Abiba Birhain, Dr. Hannah Zevin, and Marika Seafor. These events will be free, virtual, and professionally live captioned. Keep checking back on our website or follow us on Eventbrite, Facebook, or Twitter for more updates. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila, Rakef, and more. We have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you may type your questions in the Q&A box, and there will be some time during the second part of the event for Dr. Annalee Newitz to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we are grateful for the discussion that you generate. Thank you also to our captioner for today, Sarah. As we welcome you into our homes and our offices through Zoom, and you welcome us into yours, let us be mindful of space and place. As many of you know, past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While many of the events this semester are virtual or hybrid, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as this series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. This series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities, water protectors, and people involved in land-back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you are on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. So now for today's event. I'm going to do a bit of a bio intro, and then we're going to get into the fireside chat. Dr. Annalee Newitz writes science fiction and nonfiction. They're the author of Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age and Scatter, Adapt and Remember, How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize in Science. They're also the author of the novels, The Terraformers, forthcoming in January 2023, and I'm sure all of you in attendance are super excited about that. The Future of Another Timeline, so this beautiful book right here, and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a journalist, they are the writer for the New York Times and elsewhere and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They have published in the Washington Post, Slate, Popular Science, Ars Technica, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and others. They're the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Previously, they were the founder of I09 and served as editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Annalee Newitz. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So for people in attendance tonight, it's going to work as a fireside chat. I'm going to ask a series of questions and we're going to chat about it. And then you're also welcome throughout the event to type your questions into the Q&A box. So we're going to have plenty of time for audience questions. So if you have any burning specific questions about the books, we're going to touch slightly on Annalee's forthcoming book that I'm really excited about. So there will be space to ask about that as well. But okay. So we're going to get started talking a little bit about your own biography. And I'm asking this question because I know there's folks in the audience who are grad students and early career researchers, and then also folks who have spent a lot of time in academia and are interested in other paths potentially. So you completed your PhD in English and American Studies from UC Berkeley in 1998 with a dissertation on images of monsters, psychopaths, and capitalism in 20th century American popular culture. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what led you to first shift into tech journalism, and then, we'll continue then speak about sci-fi from there.
Yeah, sure. I sometimes joke about the fact that I wrote my dissertation and did my doctoral research on representations of monsters and various other imaginary creatures, and then I went on to create representations of them. A big part of my dissertation involved thinking about technology, technology in the body, technology and alienated labor. And I had been throughout my academic career, I was working on an online publication called Bad Subjects, which was one of the, first online leftist publications that I know of. I mean, this was back in the kind of early days, even before the web. And we quickly did get on the web, which made us feel like we were in the future. And so when I was transitioning out of academia, I continued to follow my interest in the social impact of technology, looking at the culture that kind of accumulates around practices in technology. And I went to work at a couple of tech startups briefly, which was its own weird experience. And then I managed to be lucky enough to get one of the few newspaper jobs left in the world at that point. And that was at a free weekly called the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which sadly is no longer around. And so it was quite a shift to be going from academia to a high-tech environment and then back into print newspaper environment. So I kind of felt like I was I was sort of trapped in this, or not trapped, but I was traveling through this transitional moment in media, which again was super fascinating for me as someone who'd been studying media. So I was incredibly lucky to be able to make that transition, to be able to take what I learned in academia and actually apply it to what I was working on.
That's amazing. And my next question is going to have to do with kind of the forms and genre of your writing as well. So it'll still touch a bit on this journalism, but also on the other genres you've worked in. So over the course of your career, you've done academic scholarship, as you mentioned, that scholarly monograph you published with Duke University. I'll just name drop the title for folks who are interested in reading it. Pretend We're Dead, Capitalist Monsters in American Pop Culture. So you published that in 2006. We just talked a little bit about your tech journalism. And then, I mentioned in your bio, your sci-fi work, which is one of the major themes of today's fireside chat. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what you enjoy about writing across genres, how you've navigated the different genres, and if you have any preferences between the genres.
So I don't have any preferences. I am completely bi-generic or tri-generic. I love them all. And I came to fiction writing kind of late in my career. It's funny because I worked for over a decade as a tech journalist and then as a science journalist. And a lot of journalists have this kind of crazy dream of becoming fiction writers, and I never did. I always have loved reading fiction. I've always been an extremely avid science fiction book fan, and movie and TV, but books were my first love of when it comes to science fiction. And I actually, the story of how I became a fiction writer has to do with the 2008 financial downturn, because I was running a blog, IO9, where I was writing largely science journalism. And we had this mandate from the top at our company that I was going to need to cut some people from our staff. And it was a very tiny staff, and I wasn't interested in cutting anyone. And it was my site, so I was allowed to do whatever the hell I wanted with our budget. And so what I did was I took myself down to 50% time so that I could work on a novel. That was what I said. I was like, I'm going to work on a novel. And I kind of had been thinking in the back of my mind, maybe I'd like to write a novel, but that by doing that, because I had a bigger salary, I was able to actually save everyone's jobs and which my boss kind of made fun of me for, but he respected it. He was like, okay, you're kind of a weirdo socialist person. And so at that time, I had been writing, as I said, a lot of science journalism and tech journalism. And I had recently visited a lab. I promise this gets back to science fiction. I'd been visiting a lab where in California where people were studying earthquakes and how to build structures that were earthquake resistant or that could withstand a certain amount of earthquakes. And so the way that they would create artificial earthquakes seemed very counterintuitive to me. They would build a structure and then they would attach these massive robot arms to it and crush the structure really slowly in a way that imitated the kinds of stresses that would be caused by S waves and various other kinds of stressors caused by earthquakes. And I was fascinated by the arms. I just kept wanting to know more about like those robot arms and like what they were thinking about this whole arrangement, which is not a very scientific thing to think about, but it is a very science fictional thing to think about. And that was how the novel Autonomous got started, was thinking about robot arms. And of course, the main character in that novel, Paladin, loses their arm a number of times in the book. And there are characters who are robot arms. And in fact, in the book Terraformers that's coming out next, there's also a very, very minor character who's a robot arm. And so that, I think it was, I made that jump into science fiction partly because I just had some really strange ideas that I wanted to explore. And I will say that the other piece was that as a journalist, I had accumulated in my mind a lot of stories from scientists I'd interviewed that just were unprintable. Like people tell you all kinds of bonkers shit when you're interviewing them that they should not tell you, and a nastier journalist would have used those stories. People would tell me about breaking the law or circumventing unfair rules in order to get their experiments done. These weren't people who were doing harm. They were just, they were kind of bending the rules in order to do their experiments, in order to build new technologies. I interviewed one scientist who is quite accomplished in his field. And when he started his field, he was working as a hustler. And I was like, oh my God, that's such a great story. And I can never tell it. But in fiction, I could tell all these stories about how, scientists do all kinds of things that are not by the books, and that doesn't make them bad people. So I actually started writing fiction in some ways to be able to tell like bigger truths than I could in science journalism. So it was a relief and a good release, I guess. But I find that once I've written fiction for a while, I just get incredibly tired of making things up. Like you have to make everything up. And it is exhausting. Like, oh, I had to build a planet, then I had to build a character, then I had to build a political system, then I had to build a motivation, then I had to build a sex scene. Like I had to build all of that stuff. But when you do journalism, you can just write down what's actually happened. So I find that I like to shuttle back and forth. So having just finished a novel, I'm now working on a nonfiction book, and it's a relief. Like I'm like, okay, I'm just telling the facts as far as I can find them, So yeah.
Okay, I have two kind of short follow-up questions that weren't in my list. The first is, do you want to tell us what the nonfiction book is that you're working on, or is it like way too early?
Oh no, it's actually way too late.
Oh, okay.
The book is late. Yeah, I'm almost done, and it's a history of psychological and cultural warfare in the United States.
Okay.
And it's a short history, and it's the hardest book I've ever written. Actually, it's taken me much longer than I thought it would, and it's taken me to some places that are really, really dark. And yeah, I'm almost done. I just sent my editor a letter saying, I promise it's gonna come soon. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I might follow up on the question of like darkness and lightness in your work later, but I'll my other short question is, I was wondering, since you told the story with Autonomous, looking at the cover, it's the arm. Was that what, like, did you tell that to the designer or your press? Was that how the arm ended up on the cover?
The arm ended up on the cover because actually, when I handed in the manuscript, I actually had just designed a cover with a robot arm on it. And
Okay.
it didn't look like that arm, but it was just, it
Okay.
was like an arm just like sitting on the ground. So they picked up on it, which is nice.
Nice. That's awesome. It's nice when like presses want to actually work with authors to
Yeah, Tor Books is
yeah.
incredibly nice in that way.
So my next question has to do with kind of the title of today's theme of the fireside chat. So what does it mean for you for your work to be categorized as feminist and queer sci-fi? How do you feel about these labels? Are they useful or not useful for your work? How would you like your work to be categorized? Kind of whatever you want to do with kind of like that question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question a lot because you told me you were gonna want me to address it, and I feel really ambivalent about it. Like on one hand, of course, I am feminist and queer, and my work is feminist and queer. I write a lot of queer characters. I write a lot of non-binary characters. And so I think it makes sense that people look at my books and are like, whoa, this is pretty queer. Um, but it's funny because if I had told, um, I don't, I, I find it frustrating because I think what happens is that once a work, whether it's science fiction or literary fiction, gets tagged feminist or queer, it gets siloed and marginalized.
Mhm.
And also it kind of, those labels are often used to suggest things like, well, cis men wouldn't like this book,
Mhm.
which really annoys me because um, I like everyone to be able to read my books, and I'm
Mhm.
not writing books intentionally to exclude anyone. Um,
Mhm.
and I think this is really a symptom of how polarized our politics are right now, especially our cultural politics in the United States, where because something is about a marginalized group, it's immediately read as therefore it is not for anyone else.
Mhm.
Instead of it being like, and here's an even more inclusive vision of the future where we have like all my books have cis dudes in them. There's straight people fucking in my books, like,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
it's like, there they are being straight, but because there's also gay characters or trans characters or whatever, um, it, so I am happy to be correctly identified as feminist and queer, and I am happy that people see that in my work, and I'm incredibly happy to be able to have stories for people who normally don't see themselves in these kinds of narratives. But at the same time, I I don't want to be siloed. So I always feel like it was funny because okay, I was playing with GPT chat the other day,
Okay.
which is it's the AI from OpenAI that can have
Mhm.
a conversation with you. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to just see like how much it knew about male authors versus authors who were not male.
Oh no.
So I was like, tell me about like Neil Gaiman, tell me about Charles
Yeah.
Stross, and then I was asking about like queer authors, and of course I asked about myself. And so it knew a lot about Charles Stross and Neil Gaiman, by the way. And then when I asked about myself, it was like, sorry, I don't know about certain authors. And so I re-asked the question and I said, explain what Annalee Newitz has contributed to the field of science fiction and feminism instead of just science fiction. And immediately it was like, oh, well, I know all about that. Annalee Newitz
Oh
has written
wow.
all about feminism and like blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. I mean, there may be a whole other reason why the AI did that, and someone's gonna like let me know that that had nothing to do with bias. But it felt a little weird. Like it felt like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, I'm in that bucket, and that's how the
Mhm.
AI looks at me, and that has to do with how humans have written about me because the AI is just trained on human data.
Mhm. For
So
sure.
anyway, that's my tale of ambivalence.
Awesome. I mean, I think also it would, whatever anyone's response would be, it would be because of bias, whether it's with the
Sure.
AI or with the human biases trained on, right? So,
Yeah.
for sure. And then kind of following up on that question, but this is more about the characters in your books. And you kind of touched on this a bit, but in your books, your stories have non-binary characters, characters with wide-ranging gender and sexual identities, and descriptions of a wide range of family, friend, and romantic relationship structures. So can you talk about what inspires you in your character development around gender, desire, and identity? And I'm really especially thinking about autonomous here, but also maybe with your new book as well. And how you approach this character development on the level of individual characters, for like human and for really non-human characters too. So here I'm thinking about characters such as Paladin and Autonomous, and also with kind of Terraformers and like, the character who's a train and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's also a character who's a moose in the Terraformers. Okay, so that's a lot. So I guess what I'll say is that I am a big proponent of found family. Someone who has a found family. My biological family didn't fulfill the role of family for me. But I think family and community are super important for people. And I believe, and I've said in a couple of places that I think that the smallest unit of political resistance is friendship. And I really believe that, and that's a lot of what my books deal with, is how do we take friendship and turn it into community, and how does community become a form of political action, and or how does it become like the ground for political action? And so I'm not against, once again, I'm not against biological families, but I want to acknowledge in my work that community comes to us where it comes. It comes out of desire, it comes out of commonalities, and those aren't always biological ties. And I actually think it's toxic to fetishize biological ties. I think that leads to all kinds of fascist positions. It becomes about who has what blood, and like who's authorized to have a particular position based on their biological inheritance, which is just obviously complete bullshit. So part of my joy in my characters finding their non-biological families is a political thing, and part of it is just, it's what I've experienced in my own life. And I think that's another way in which people think of my work as queer, because that is a very strong tradition in the queer community. It's also a big tradition in the leftist community as well, finding family through political connections. So when I'm thinking of characters, characters always come to me embedded in a social context, because I'm that kind of nerd. I love social world building. So I like to offer readers, a way to think of those social connections outside traditional family. In my novel that's coming out early next year, The Terraformers, one of the things I did very consciously is I wrote it as it's a multi-generational epic, which is like one of my favorite genres. And usually those are like, it's about a mother, her daughter, and their granddaughter, right? It's always like biological generations. And I created 3 generations that are connected through mentorship, like professional mentorship, and through scientific community connections. And I wanted to show that that's a form of multi-generational connection, but it isn't, the traditional form. So I hope that answered all of your questions.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah. If people have follow-up questions too, they can ask in the chat. And also for people who are attending, like you can also write in your questions now, so that way they're like queued up for when we get to that. I still have a couple more questions though, but just if someone has a burning question they want to ask. So your books are also, it's quite evident that you have spent a lot of time looking at actual technologies and science, obviously kind of through your journalistic work, And I think that lends so much to the descriptions that you have of tech in your book. They're so rich. So whether it's the practices kind of surrounding the travel stones and the future of another timeline, all of that too also speaks so much to how universities function. So I feel like we can see kind of your own history in academia in that. And then we also see relatedly specific descriptions of biolabs and postdoc culture and autonomous. And also in autonomous, there's these specific descriptions of biotech, biopiracy, and such specific details, including how wrappers are biodegradable and the shields that dome over the cities block heat, and even how different life forms have been utilized in the construction of buildings. As you are also a nonfiction tech writer, to what degree do you feel beholden to actual and current tech possibilities within your sci-fi? And are you finding that changes? I'll ask that part first, to like what degree you feel beholden, and then I'll ask the follow-up kind of around AI. And also maybe along this, like to what degree are you beholden question, maybe to follow up on something you were talking about earlier too, is there something that is actually like in utilizing some of these real aspects of technologies, do you find kind of a freedom there compared to when you're saying like sometimes it's exhausting to build every aspect of the world?
Yeah, no, I will start with the last question first, because
okay.
Yes, I'm a writer who really enjoys constraint. When I was much younger and I was a poet, I used to really love writing forms of poetry that required like certain kinds of meter and stuff like that, because I was like, ooh, once I have like a structure, I can like put things in, and it's very satisfying. So I often do force myself to have those kinds of constraints in my writing. And when I'm doing science fiction, I always interview a number of experts in order to try to reflect what's possible scientifically.
Okay.
Not always. I mean, I shouldn't say not always. I always interview experts. Sometimes I just decide to take a leap. I mean, that's the thing that's nice about fiction, is that, like, for example, in Autonomous, I have robots who are artificially intelligent. They have human equivalent intelligence. They have emotions. They have desires. They have an unconscious mind and a conscious mind. And I don't believe that we're going to have that, at least not in 150 years, which is basically when the novel takes place. I think that generalized artificial intelligence is like one of these Silicon Valley dreams that's, kind of, it's for getting VC money. It's for kind of business plans that never come to fruition. And so I often, when I would talk about it, I would kind of apologize, because I would be like, well, I don't really think this is going to happen. But a lot of people who were AI believers just really got off on that book, because they're like, dude, oh, there's like these robots and they have consciousness and blah, blah. And I was like, okay, I guess I contributed to some like bad beliefs about how AI might work in the real world. But at least those people got to think about AI and gender, because that's a big theme in the book. So I think that was helpful. And I did hear from a lot of AI designers who said that they'd never thought about that stuff before. And so that was quite nice. And the other thing is that I think it makes a book, I think that when you're confabulating, when you're telling a story that's really, in some sense, unrealistic, something that's set on another planet or set in the future, it's really grounding to have details that are based on real science or real social relationships or real political issues. And so that's kind of how I build my worlds. I like them to be very lived in, to be very realistic, and then also to have a few elements that are just bonkers, right? Like, oh, and also we have like robots who are having sex with hot dudes. Like, that's going on. And so, I think it gives you a nice balanced narrative when you do that.
Awesome. And I mean, you already touched on the AI question, so I'm not going to say it aloud. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I like jumped the gun.
Oh,
Like the
yeah,
AI
no
thing is
worries. No, that
so,
was great.
yeah.
It flowed very naturally. In Autonomous, readers are brought along with Paladin as this character experiences different aspects of robot culture in Tunisia and Vancouver and in labs in the Canadian prairies. As a side note, I just love how often like Canada is mentioned in your work. And for folks who haven't read the book yet, and I'm emphasizing the word yet here because it's a must read. Seriously, if you haven't read it yet, I hope you do. But some robots are indentured and others are free. So I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about the way you think and write about non-human cultures and how your new book, Terraformers, speaks about non-human cultures as well.
Sure. So in Autonomous, one of the things that I really wanted to explore was how certain aspects of human civilization could improve. For example, in Autonomous, there is a lot of carbon neutral technology. There's been a lot of work done to mitigate the damage from climate change. And that's very positive. Obviously, that's something that many of us are hoping for. At the same time, there is an international organization that handles property rights. That's kind of like the UN, but more fucked up. And that organization has ushered in a new set of laws, which are framed as laws around freedom to work laws. And they're basically just ushering in indentured servitude and enslavement. And which, of course, like I said, is framed as a form of liberation because workers are now free to be owned. And isn't that nice? Because if you're indentured, your boss will provide you with food and housing. Like, what could be better? And and in some few cases, like that is nice for people. We do see examples of people who are middle class and indentured, but mostly, of course, it's just like slavery has been throughout the world. And I wanted to situate that thought experiment around robots because I wanted to highlight a couple of sneaky legal things that happen that I think are quite plausible, which is that in the sort of backstory of Autonomous, robots have been granted human equivalent status. So they possess a certain number of human rights. However, robots cost a lot of money to build. And so there has to be some incentive for companies to build them. I mean, if they're just going to build them and they're going to go free, why would you bother building them? So the incentive is that they can possess those robots as indentured servants for 10 years. So they build them. And then eventually the idea is that the robot gains their autonomy, and hence the title of the book. In reality, of course, most of those robots perish before they reach that stage. But the sneaky part is that because robots are human equivalent and they can be indentured, lawyers argue, well, humans should be allowed to be indentured as well, like obviously. And so I liked the idea of doing that because we often talk about in science fiction, there's this trope of like how robots will enslave humans. And this is a story about how the existence of robots allows humans to become enslaved again. But it's through this route that I think is much more realistic, which is just sneaky corporate lawyer stuff and an erosion of worker rights. So I like the idea of thinking about robots being a new form of consciousness, but also fitting into this very old position within human civilization, which is the position of the enslaved person. And it's my belief that if you have slavery in any part of your civilization, then your entire civilization is haunted by slavery. You can't just enslave one tiny group and then everyone else is fine. Everything is tainted. And this is also a preoccupation in the Terraformers too. The Terraformers is actually a sequel to Autonomous. It's just set 60,000 years in the future, so none of the characters are the same. But they are also dealing with indenture, and indenture is much more intimate because everyone is biologically engineered. So robots can be made, humans can be made. Non-human animals can be made, and they can be designed in all different ways to limit their freedom and limit their ability to express themselves. And so that book was really fun to do because I got to have robot characters such as the sentient flying train, because of course public transit, I think, would be a very interesting kind of person to talk to. I'd love to just hang out and chat with a train. But also there's a lot of non-human animal characters. So there's a heroic moose named Whistle, who has a difficult romance with another moose. So I got to have some moose love, or moose melodrama. And there's a cat character who's an investigative journalist. There's naked mole rats, of course, because obviously. And like there's a cyborg cow who becomes radicalized and starts helping other non-human animals to fight back against various corporate powers. So I really wanted to just extend my thinking about non-human people out into the whole world. I kind of take a kind of animist approach to the world.
Awesome. Yeah, I am very excited to read the whole thing. You sent me the arc and I started to dive into it. I'm like, oh my gosh, but I need the physical copy so I can
really enjoy it'll be nice.
My eyes are starting. I was like, no, this deserves like intense and intense reading that on the screen. It was just like painful.
Yeah.
But the book so far, I was hooked on that first paragraph. I was like, this is so cool. Anyways, so yeah, I'm very excited when I have my physical copy to devour it. So just for people in the audience, I might ask one more question and then we're going to open it up to larger discussion and more questions lined up in case people are feeling shy, but I hope you take advantage of this great opportunity to ask questions. So I'm telling you that I'm asking one more just so you have time to like type up your questions. No pressure though. So we have lots of students and writers listening to this event. So I'm hoping you can speak a little bit more about your writing process, especially for your fiction work. But if you want to talk about your nonfiction writing process as well, if it's different, if you kind of go about it similarly, take that as you want.
Sure. Well, they are very different processes, but I will say that they both start with research. I do lots and lots of research. I find research super fun. It's like that moment in the process of writing where there's like a million possibilities and you haven't started writing yet, so you don't have a bunch of like first draft garbage on the page that just makes you sad. So you're like, this is going to be the greatest, and I'm going to put all this research in. So with any fictional work, like I said, I start by kind of investigating different scientific concepts that I might be including, or social or cultural concepts. When I started working on The Future of Another Timeline, which is a time travel novel, I had this idea that it would be, I was going to do the most scientific time travel ever done. And so I interviewed a couple of physicists and they were both like, yeah, no, like time travel is not real. It's never going to be real. That's just totally a lie. And I felt a little cheated. But one of them said to me, listen, it's not a scientific device, it's a literary device. So like use it as a literary device and just own it. And so instead of trying to convince readers that this was scientific, I thought about what I wanted it to do metaphorically. And then I thought about how scientists would study something like this, even though it could never exist. If it did exist, what would be the scientific approach to it? So I do a lot of that like world building stuff. I think a lot about characters. Like I often start out with the world building. Like I'm like, okay, I want to make a world where X is happening. But with autonomous, definitely the first thing that came to me was Paladin the robot. It was like Paladin has an arm and Paladin just lost their arm. And so Paladin is sad. And so I had this image in my mind of this robot getting their arm shot off and having to cope with that. So the writing process, once I get started writing, each book is different. Like some are really fast, some are slower. I continue to do research as I work on the book. Sometimes it's really arduous. With Terraformers, I was building ecosystems. Luckily, they were Earth-like ecosystems, but I would be like, it's so funny because like I would write a paragraph that would take me hours because I'd be like, okay, what plants would be in a tropical savanna? Like, what even is a tropical savanna? Like, how does that even happen? And so I would just spend all this time researching the plants, and I'm like arduously like, okay, then they see this kind of plant. Okay, then they're in the mud, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, the reader is like, I read that in 30 seconds or like less. They read it in like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
So the writing process is funny like that, where it always takes much longer to create something that you read really fast. So it's always, it's a process of convincing yourself every day to just keep writing, even though it might be very slow or arduous. So yeah, it's, and of course I do a lot of revision. So that's another thing. And I actually have come to, in my old age, I have come to appreciate that revision is actually quite delightful, mainly because my first drafts are so freaking terrible. So I like when I get to the revision part because I'm like, okay, now I'm making it pretty. Whereas before it was kind of mangled.
Awesome. Okay, so for folks in attendance, no one's put a question in yet. So please write in questions. I still have more, but yeah, we really hope you can use this opportunity to ask questions. And Sydney, also, if you have a question as well, you can feel free to pop in. But I guess while we're waiting for people to ask their question, the start of Terraformers has that map in it, and maps are in other parts of your work. And I know I was fortunate enough to hear you speak a little bit about your relationship with maps when you did the event at Le Gouillon. But I was wondering if you can kind of talk about your relationship with maps. Are you still working with the same map maker that I think you mentioned at that event? And kind of about how you're visualizing the geography of the places.
Yeah, so I think the map that I was talking about at that event was in my nonfiction book, Four Lost Cities, which is a book about 4 archaeological sites that are cities. And I worked with this fellow, Jason Thompson, who designs maps for Dungeons and Dragons. And I specifically wanted to work with him. I mean, first of all, I had long admired his maps. He does a lot of map designs, and I just think they're incredible. But also, I wanted readers to come into these stories with like a vibe of Dungeons and Dragons or Game of Thrones, like to feel like, okay, I'm entering another world, and to have that kind of feeling of the fantastical, even though everything, of course, is completely real and scientific, or as scientific as it can be. Archaeology, as archaeologists will tell you, is not a science. It is a humanities discipline. Interestingly, for Terraformers, which has 3 maps in it, which I was freaking psyched when they told me I could have 3 maps, because one of the maps is just a subway map. I mean, it's not a subway map. It's a map for a sentient flying train, but it looks like a subway map. And I was like, I get to do a subway map. So we worked with someone who is a professional map maker who does like just city maps. Like I don't think he'd ever done a fantasy map before. And I mean, it's a sci-fi story, not a fantasy story, but I don't think he'd ever done. He was a little confused by some of the stuff in the maps. He was like, what is this? Wait, where is this place? We had a couple of conversations where he was very kind, like his maps are great, but it was definitely new for him. And I had to draw a bunch of the maps for him, and then we had to kind of go back and forth a lot. So the maps in Terraformers are they're hyper realistic. And one of them is just a map that shows a massive hydroengineering project. It's just so that you can picture it, because it's such a huge project that it's really hard to imagine, like, how do you reroute a river, and there's like multiple dams and multiple riverbeds. And I interviewed this Colorado River expert who gave me his name's Kyle House. Highly recommend that you check out Kyle House. He has a lot of gorgeous pictures online from his work. And he was just like, here's how rivers work. One of the things he taught me was that rivers are mostly silt. I think of rivers as water, but he was like, actually, rivers are water that is carrying silt. So that's why they reshape the land, because they're constantly depositing silt everywhere. Anyway, fun river facts.
Awesome. Well, we have our first audience question. This is from RLW, who writes, "Hi, do you have any tips for getting through the first draft without feeling discouraged, since it is, as you said, mingled?" And they said they're enjoying the chat.
I think part of it is just constantly psyching yourself up, because it is true that, one part of it is just realizing, like, you know what, you're going to get to revise this. It's going to be fine. Like, it is going to look really ugly. I'm sure there's someone out there who writes perfect first drafts, and that person, good for them. But most of us, like, sometimes I'll even, like, if I'm really struggling, I will just put like a TK in there. And TK is just like an editing thing from journalism, because allegedly no words contain TK, so they're easy to search for in a document. However, someone recently pointed out to me that fart knocker contains TK. So you use the word fart knocker, you will find it. But anyway, so yeah, I actually had a scene in my recent novel that's like a giant war, and it's like war scenes are incredibly hard to write. They're really complicated, and they need to be emotional, and there's a lot of things moving around. And I was just like, okay, I'm just not writing this right now. TK, people will die. Okay, next paragraph. So I think the thing about first drafts is, like, once you're done, you have such a feeling of accomplishment and completion that, like, it really is like unlike anything else. And then you have that energy to go back. I find I have that energy then to go back and be like, okay, I'm filling in the war scene, I'm filling in all the stuff. But my best advice is just constantly remind yourself, every writer feels like their first draft sucks. And that's just how it is. It's like, it just is going to look bad, and it's going to be better later. You're going to make it beautiful.
Awesome. Thank you. Sydney, did you have a question since you popped on?
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I'm sorry, I'm really enjoying like the interview. I'm just wondering how you go about receiving criticism. I'm wondering like what your process is like, if you show people like whilst you're writing, like how much criticism you take. Do you stay very true to what you thought originally? Like, are you open to changing based on like the feedback that you get? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, that's an incredibly good question. And I think of criticism as being one of the most important parts of writing. And it's part of that polishing process, right? So what I typically do is, so partly I start by doing some interviews with people. So I've kind of front loaded, like, I'll run my ideas by people. And not just scientists. Like, if I'm writing about, like, for example, in my new novel, I include some elements of Cree culture, like far future indigenous culture. And I kind of focused on Cree culture. And I talked to a Cree filmmaker, Sonia Ballantyne, who's freaking awesome. And I just was like, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And she was like, no, but this other thing is okay. And so I knew going in, like, okay, I've already kind of run some of these ideas by her. Not that she speaks for everyone, but like, I just, I wanted to have some feedback before completely, making a mess of it. And then once I have a draft that isn't completely disgusting, but isn't finished, I will show it to sensitivity readers. I will show it to other writers. I'll show it to scientists if I think there's enough reason to bother them and be like, okay, is this going to work? And then I find that is really, really valuable. I actually completely changed a subplot in my most recent novel based on feedback that I got from a sensitivity reader. They were just like, guess what? This is all wrong. And I was like, oh, thank the gods that you told me that that is all wrong. And I think it's way better now. Like it was, I think that the subplot is much more like interesting overall, as well as being more accurate. So and also my editor, of course, gives me feedback. Like my editor at Tor actually usually makes me do at least 2 drafts. Like she'll, in other words, I'll have done a couple drafts, I give it to her, and then she's like, do another draft, do another draft. So hopefully by the time it's done, I have eliminated most of the cluelessness, and I've eliminated most of the awkwardness, and some of the, scientific misconceptions and stuff like that. But there's always, room for more feedback. And I feel like getting criticism on one work helps inform the next work too. So like there's always that as well, like thinking about like, oh, I would do the theme really differently next time. And I actually did that. Like I got a lot of feedback on this one aspect of Autonomous that I really took on board, and I really changed the way I approached it in the Terraformers. So yeah, I love criticism. I mean, I like constructive criticism, not like you're a dipshit criticism. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And yeah, so we're still welcoming folks to write in questions. But I was curious if, in your role as a journalist, if you then sometimes will interview people for their scientific work and then months later or years later go back and interview them for the actual like science fiction that you're doing too. Have you kind of had relationships with certain like specialists that you've kind of consulted on both sides?
Oh, definitely, for sure. Yeah. In all kinds of ways. Like for a while, I was writing a lot about biotech, and several of the scientists that I'd interviewed about biotech got enlisted to do critical reads of Autonomous. And it was funny because like I was thinking, like, give me critical feedback on the science. And one of the scientists was like, actually, the science is fine, but like the way you've named certain types of scientific instruments is completely wrong. And like, we wouldn't call every single scientific instrument, like I called these things fabbers that are just like fabricators that make stuff. And he's like, why is everything a fabber? Like, we wouldn't call them all fabbers. We would have different names for all of them. And I was like, oh yeah, that's true. So that's why getting critical feedback is like really helpful, because people will catch shit that you never even thought was a thing. So yeah, that was good. And I've also gone the other way. Like I've interviewed people for fiction and then come back and talk to them about, a scientific article that, they're working on or something like that. And especially with archaeologists, like archaeology knowledge applies to nonfiction, of course, but also it's just a helpful way of thinking about alternate civilizations. So
wonderful. Yeah. And I mean, I had asked you previously, but kind of your question of making the choice of like using geologists for the stones and the time travel versus historians, but that was my own bias as a historian. But yeah. Oh, it looks like we have another question that popped up. So someone asked the question, an anonymous attendee writes, how do you approach the theme of hope in your novels?
Yeah, that's a theme that I am always thinking about. And I mean, one basic answer to that is that I never write utopias or dystopias. I call them topias. Just I want my futures and my alternate worlds to feel realistic, which means that some things are bad and some things are maybe better than our world, depending on your definition of good and bad, because of course, one person's hope is another person's, tragedy. So I always want my readers and my characters to have hope no matter what has happened in the story. But I also think that for hope to be realistic, you have to have struggle. I mean, that's how I've experienced hope in my life. And I think that's how many people experience it, is that you have to fight to have it, because things don't always work out. And especially if you're trying to change the world in a progressive way, like there's just so many forces arrayed against you and so many setbacks and so many times that like fascists get elected to be president of your country. Apparently that's a thing now that's happening, at least in my country, in the United States. And so I often am struggling with my own need to have hope and trying to give that to my characters. And one of the things that I think about when I'm constructing a novel is that there's an emotional arc to the story. Of course, there's the character arcs and there's like, plot arcs, but there's also, I want people to feel that fear of like losing, the tragedy of loss, the agony of like arguing with friends over how to change things. And then I always want to have a moment, perhaps the climactic moment, where there is that sense of like, okay, we actually can make things better. And maybe we won't make things better everywhere. Maybe we can't save the galaxy, but maybe we can save this city or this group of people or this group of refugees can be given a new home and like try again. And like that's my biggest feeling of hope, is it's the try again feeling. Like we're just gonna keep going, and it's gonna suck and it's gonna hurt, but sometimes it's gonna be really fun, and sometimes we're gonna get laid, and sometimes we're gonna win, and sometimes we're gonna make things better, and we can walk down the street with our gay lover and people won't hurt us. And like that is gonna happen. It is happening. And I just want people to like come away from these books feeling like that it's gonna be, that we can keep going, and there is a reason to live and a reason to like help the next generation live too.
Thank you for that answer. I'm hoping people felt hopeful after that, because I sure did. RLW writes, any advice on building planets, world building? This person writes that they find that they can get too lost in the tiny details that ultimately don't matter to the story. So where do you start, and how do you balance details versus letting the reader fill in their own interpretations of the setting?
Yes. Oh my God. This is very relatable. I also get very, very lost in the details. And I find that it helps me with world building to try to do the world building not on the page, like not in the novel, like to start with the world building, like in a document that's literally like, I had a document for the Terraformers that was just called world building. Same thing with Autonomous. Actually, I guess I've done that with all my novels. Sometimes the world building is different. Like sometimes, like in Future of Another Timeline, it was like the timeline. I had this huge document about like the timeline and how it had changed and like all of these terrible diagrams. So I try to do a ton of world building like off screen, and then have like a really vivid sense in my mind of the world. But then as I'm writing the novel itself, I try to give the characters an experience of the world, kind of like how anyone would walk through the world, right? Like as you're walking down the street, you're not thinking to yourself, well, as you know, Bob, we power things using coal, and we have electricity, and we have an electrical grid, and these houses are built using stone, but others are built from trees. And do you know where the trees come from? Like that's not how you experience it. You just like, you're like, yeah, I took a left, here at the, place where the sidewalk stopped, and I walked past this house, there was a wooden fence. I don't worry about where the wood came from. And so I think it helps to have all that backstory in your head, and then like leak little bits of it to your reader to give that world a lived in feeling. But as for when to stop, like sometimes you just have to give yourself some boundaries. Like you have to say like, all right, I've built enough world now, I'm just gonna start. And then if you get to a place in the book where you're like, okay, my character reached the end of the sidewalk, uh-oh, like, what next? Then you can go back to your world building document and be like, okay, here's a million details about like the last 400 years and all of the kings who like, you know, hoarded wood and like wouldn't allow anyone to build sidewalks out of wood or whatever, right? So it's definitely like easy to rat hole on world building. So like I said, that's why it's good to have the runoff document. And then, you know, if people get super excited about your world building, you can write a blog post about like all the extra stuff that you didn't put in. Like I have so many details about autonomous that are like not in the story. And maybe one day I'll do something with them.
Awesome. I almost wonder if with autonomous you might like do another like genre, like even like with like visuals and stuff of those other details. I can imagine it like a companion graphic novel or something.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Really cool. So I mean, it sounds like you're, you know, you're talking about all the different projects and writing across genre. And I'm wondering if while you're working on whichever project you're working on, if you start to kind of picture like, okay, well, this will be my next sci-fi novel. You know, if like you already have something in your mind that you're already thinking about as you're wrapping up your current nonfiction book, if you kind of have a sense of where you're headed.
I do. I do, especially now. I'm almost done with my current nonfiction book. And because it's been such a hard book to write, I've been kind of telling myself, like, I've sort of planned out what my next fiction is going to be, and am like using it as like a carrot, just like, okay, if you finish this horribly depressing book about psychological warfare, you get to write this next thing. And I thought that maybe I would do like I often find that like the work from my nonfiction kind of pervades my fiction. Like I learn a lot of the stuff as I'm doing the nonfiction, and then I'm like, oh, well, I'm gonna have, like, for example, the Terraformers is full of city building, like it has lots and lots of urban planning and stuff. And that's clearly because I've been thinking about ancient cities for years. But actually, I don't think my next novel is going to be influenced by my psychological war book at all. It's going to be like totally another thing.
in the sci-fi realm or still, or
so this is what I'm yes. So I'm thinking
I'm not trying to get you to say more than you want to.
I will tell you, but I'm going to tell you right now, like I could be lying, like I could end up writing something totally different, but right now I've totally fallen in love with this character that I keep thinking about, who is an alien grad student who's studying this weird thing. Sometimes life forms like form civilizations on planets, which is like, why would you do that? But you know, you got to write your thesis about something, right? And so this alien comes to Earth and decides to study life forms that are on these precarious planets. And so they go to live in a brothel in an ancient Roman city, which actually I have written a lot about brothels in ancient Roman cities. So it is a little bit influenced by my archaeology work, but I just love the idea of like this alien graduate student, like what they're really interested in is like, why would you live on like a big rock on top of lava? And like all the people around them are like, I'm dealing with all these social issues around like sexuality and stuff. And the alien's just like, but how do you feel about like rock? Like, eventually the alien figures out that there's things other than the rock, but like, anyway, I really like this alien character, and I think that this character is going to go somewhere. So we'll see. Maybe they won't go to ancient Rome, but I think they might.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I'm excited for that. I know we'll have a couple years to wait for that.
Yes, definitely. I'll be starting work on that next year. So we'll see if it really happens, but I'm pretty sure. I'm under contract with Tor to do another novel. So there has to be a novel. And
okay.
This one has to, I don't know. I'm kind of excited. Nice.
Well, I always like following the excitement when it comes to writing, you know?
Yeah, right? That's like what you have to do.
I'm again going to invite people if they have any, because we'll wrap up in a couple minutes otherwise, because I don't want to monopolize your time of me just asking all of my side questions. But so we will give you the opportunity to ask any other questions. And maybe in the meantime, because, you know, you're talking about this alien character, grad student, you were a grad student, grad school comes up a lot in your work.
Yes.
It's kind of pervasive in your writing. And so I'm wondering if you have, and because you transitioned away from academia, if you have any kind of words of wisdom or advice for folks who are in that kind of potentially transitioning away from academia or navigating that, and like, however you want to speak to that question.
Yeah. Well, I can say that when I was a grad student, I really believed that I felt like my calling was to be an academic. And when I realized that the realities of the job market meant that even if I was super awesome, I wouldn't necessarily get an academic job. It was a huge blow. Like, I really felt like it was probably the biggest challenge to my identity that I'd ever dealt with up until that point. And I was having to just wrap my mind around wait, I'm not going to be a professor. Who am I? And I think my first advice is to remember that grad school is not training you to be an academic. It can, you absolutely can become an academic, and yay if that happens, but it's training for you to be someone who's a critical thinker, or if you're in the sciences, it's training you to understand whatever your scientific field is. It's training you to have an approach to knowledge, and that approach can be used in all kinds of places. And I think my biggest fear when I left academia was, I had two fears. One was that I was going to become stupid, which is, I think, was purely a result of toxic academic culture, where there's this idea that only those of us within the academy are smart, darling, which turns out no. There's a lot of smart people that are not in academia, and also being smart is not really a thing. It's just a made up idea. And the other thing that really scared me was I would never get to be a teacher. I really love teaching, and I was really scared that I would not have that pedagogical feeling. And I found both. I found that, first of all, I found the whole thing about smart, the idea of smart was completely constructed and silly. But I also found that through my writing and through working on publications and working in various writer communities, that I have gotten to teach, and I've gotten to teach in ways that aren't just in the classroom. I've gotten to teach through writing books and talking to people like this, get to just chat with people and hear from folks who want to learn new things, or just want to find out about things they'd never heard of. And so it turned out fine. And it really is possible to teach outside the classroom, to learn tons of new stuff, even if you're not in the academy. But I will say also that the other thing I've realized is that I probably unconsciously picked a field of journalism that brought me back to universities all the time, except not in my field. So it was I have gone to so many awesome university campuses. I've been to so many labs. I've met so many cool academics. And in a way, I kind of didn't leave. I'm kind of a para-academic because I'm still kind of in that world. And so I didn't have to leave, really. I had to leave the dream of being a tenure track professor, because that doesn't exist for very many people. But I've still gotten to have all the cool shit that I was promised as an academic. So I feel really lucky because of that. But I guess all I'm trying to say is to offer reassurance that you get to have a rich intellectual life beyond the academy. And in a way, it's almost kind of better, because there's less of that intellectual hierarchy that we have in academia, which is just so, I think, antithetical to learning, when it's all about the performance of where you teach and where you publish and who cites you, which is just such crap. It's often the people who are doing the most innovative work are not being cited because they're not part of this accepted hierarchy. And so anyway, actually my new novel, The Terraformers, there's a huge subplot in there about the idea of intelligence as a constructed idea and as a weapon, like how intelligence is weaponized to hurt people. And so I poured a lot of feelings in there, I guess. About
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that response. I really liked hearing it. Sydney, do you want to read the question from Marie?
Yeah, so Marie asks, what advice would you give to someone who would like to dip their toes in fiction writing?
So I guess it depends on where you're coming from, like what kind of fiction you want to do. But I mean, my first advice, of course, is to read a ton of fiction, especially the kind of fiction that you want to write. I mean, that's how I learned to write fiction, was just from reading a lot of stuff. And then also there's the question of like, what do you want to do with your fiction? Like if by dip your toes, you mean like you want to sell your fiction, that's a really different question than like, what if I just want to try writing fiction like for pleasure? If you want to try writing fiction for pleasure, of course, you should just do it. I mean, you should always just do it, right? Like you don't need to take a class. I know a lot of people really love NaNoWriMo, which just happened in November, National Novel Writing Month. And I've never done it, but it sounds really fun. And I think that it's nice because it's like a big community of people who are doing it, and you can kind of check in and like help each other along. So I think that's one way that folks sometimes write their first novels. I know a lot of professional writers who wrote their first novels doing that. There's no harm in it. I mean, it's not like a bad thing. Also writing fanfic, such a good way to get into fiction writing. So many great writers start by writing fanfic. AO3, an archive of our own, which you can find online at archiveofourown.org. They are a terrific resource for fanfic. And it's the thing that's nice about fanfic is you can write it, you can post it and get feedback. Like that critical feedback that we were talking about earlier, like you get really good writing communities there. So I would say like try fanfic. And fanfic is really an expansive thing. Like you don't have to go out and like pick a story and be like, I am now writing about, Archie and Veronica from, or like I am writing about the brothers from Supernatural. You can just write a story that's like vaguely connected somehow to one of these universes, one of these franchises or whatever. So that's kind of my advice. My advice is don't take it too seriously. Like just write what you want to write, and like just don't let anyone stop you. Like don't let you stop you, because your brain is your worst enemy. Just like if your brain starts saying don't do it or this is foolish, just be like, shut up, brain. I do that all the time. Try not to do it out loud, but sometimes I do.
Awesome. Well, it's 7:15. So, and we haven't gotten any more questions. So I was just wondering if there's anything you want to wrap up on, or, I mean, I think people know they can buy your books at bookstores, but if you want to plug where people should get your books from or anything like that to wrap us up.
Sure. I mean, I always prefer for folks to get my books at their local indie bookstore. That's the best place to do it. And like tell your local bookseller that you love them. Or whatever is appropriate to tell them that is enthusiastic and appreciative. And if you are interested in science fiction and politics and science, I host a bi-weekly podcast called Our Opinions Are Correct. You can find it at ouropinionsarecorrect.com. My co-host is Charlie Jane Anders, who's an incredibly great science fiction writer and comic book writer. And we talk about all kinds of stuff, from imperialist fantasies in science fiction to the weird career of Anne Rice, which is an episode that's coming up. And we have lots of great guests, and yeah, it's kind of a fun podcast, totally independent.
So. Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic and so great. And I want to thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Sydney for doing the tech. Thank you, Sarah, for doing the captioning. And thank you everyone for coming to the event. Like I mentioned at the start of the event, we're going to have a lot of events coming up in the winter. I just need to create the pages, so those will be up soon so you can register for those events. Thank you so much, and thank you for being with us through 2022, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Sydney, if you want to stop the recording. This was